Research Institute. It's basically research studies done since from present to 1970s, and yeah, you take it away.
Sure. Yeah. So hey everybody. I'll be presenting, as just mentioned, CARI, or the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute. And what we focus on mainly is consumer design, consumer-oriented design from about the 1970s to the present day, because it's an area that hasn't been studied as much, as well as it's an era there was definitely a kind of explosion in consumer design over that time period. So we've really dedicated our efforts to really intensely diving in to exactly what have we missed, what are the design movements and trends that have really kind of shaped the society over the late 20th century and now into the early 21st. We'll just read off our mission statement here. So we're mainly an online community dedicated to developing a taxonomy of recent design aesthetics in modern consumer culture, and we like to put them in the context of various societal trends, cultural trends, economic trends. And right now we are currently working on a centralized website to really pull all our findings together and then kind of create a really engaging and interactive way of exploring the past 30 or 40 years of design. And so here what you see is a little bit of our ideation process around branding. You'll kind of see more of the reasoning behind these particular logos as I kind of go through the particular aesthetic categories. We've just been out developing kind of identities for them based on their particular aesthetics, and kind of figuring out how we can create channels for that kind of content and get people really kind of engaged with kind of discovering how they interact with each other, their timelines, and how they've kind of influenced their own lives, or because all of this consumer design really kind of forms the background for our kind of designed landscape in a city or suburban setting or pretty much everywhere. So kind of just starting right off with how I got really interested in this particular field of study. So I, like a long time ago, I was really into this music called Vaporwave, which just kind of describe it here because it's a little odd. But so it's a microgenre of electronic music and an internet meme that emerged in the early 2010s. It's defined by an appropriation of 1980s and 1990s mood music styles, kind of music that was definitely forgotten and not super appreciated, maybe even kind of hated to a certain extent. Smooth jazz, elevator music, various like New Jack Swing, R&B music, lounge. And what they would do is kind of take these tracks and manipulate them, or kind of chop them up and slow them down and kind of mix them together, and then kind of create this, kind of strange, nostalgic, hazy sort of feeling with that music, and also bringing that kind of background music, it kind of forms background consumer music to the forefront, and really kind of putting it on focus. So it kind of developed its own subculture, and it is associated with kind of a satirical take on really consumer capitalism and the kind of current late-stage capitalist kind of society that we exist in at the moment. It's very surreal, and yeah, so I got pretty into that field, into that kind of music genre, kind of going over what it looked like. It had that particular sound, and the aesthetic tried to kind of follow the particular sound as well. So here I just did a straight Google search of Vaporwave and this, Vaporwave visuals, and what you get is this kind of interesting melange of 1980s and 1990s, kind of marble floors and sunset grids and stuff, and this stuff is pretty popular now with all the retro movements and, like Ready Player One and all the kind of obsession with 80s music and everything right now. You can see that kind of formed a lot of the basis for what this aesthetic became in the early 2010s and became associated with this music. And then diving in kind of deeper as I got really interested into this particular field was kind of some of the conceptual basis behind the music and the kind of the mood of it. So it's kind of mainly centered on these concepts of hauntology, which is kind of a term that's used to just talk about the way that contemporary culture has kind of this issue of a persistent sort of recycling of different retro aesthetics, which I think we're currently living through right now. Anytime you're going out, it's like, oh, the newest 80s revival thing, or the 90s is back or something, and then the fashion, the 2000s is back, and you see these kind of articles recycling themselves almost constantly. And so they've kind of used this term to describe how we're sort of preoccupied with this idea of temporal disjunction and sort of an idea of nostalgia for lost futures. Nostalgia for lost futures I found was really particularly interesting, how in the 90s you had a particular vision of the future and what things would be like by this point, and kind of projecting that out and thinking about how things would have gone and how they really have not gone that way. In the 80s, it didn't turn out like people thought the future would be in the 80s. It's always a constantly changing, kind of morphing beings. So it's really interesting to see how artists have kind of taken this idea and then really run with it. And then the next concept is hypnagogic, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but hypnagogic pop. And it's talking about, it's kind of termed as pop music that's reflected through a memory of a memory. And it's just talking, it kind of plays off that concept of nostalgia and the kind of hazy vagary, vague kind of notions of, you know, our childhood, and then what you kind of hear in the background, and then how that can kind of influence what you create when you're kind of age to start really, you know, working with music and things like that, and what it influences. So that kind of forms a lot of the basis for what Vaporwave music kind of deals with, and what my kind of interest in that particular genre kind of led to. Here you kind of have that idea of the kind of reappropriation of 80s and 90s aesthetic tropes, even some 2000s as well there. You've got kind of, you know, America Online and the swooshy.com type logos, and various kind of, you know, retro artifacts of, you know, 1980s postmodern design, the Roman busts and columns and palms, and, you know, the kind of pastel colors and things like that. And they've been taken and then kind of reappropriated into different contexts to create something technically really, really new, as well as kind of homing in on different kind of aesthetics that form this idea of, you know, what we see on the internet with, you know, rendered environments and just kind of an endless stream of products that are available on an endless number of websites. So here you got, you know, kind of taking this kitchen that's, you know, trying to sell some condo in some other, you know, somewhere in the planet, they're trying to sell us, and they're just using these kind of particular imagery. So it's playing with that imagery that has now kind of just become so omnipresent and really endless that it kind of just forms this kind of strange background in our lives. And so, kind of moving on, so this really started in 2014. I was just kind of on like a YouTube video binge, going back through stuff in like the early 2000s, you know, kind of doing a little bit like childhood nostalgia type stuff. And I actually hadn't seen this originally, but it's a Victoria Beckham music video from 2000. And it's just one of those videos where it's like a super high budget, mega music video, and she's like really just trying to capitalize on every trend you can imagine from 2000, and all the fashion, and just like matrixy looks, and like the little rimless sunglasses, and it's just going all out with trying to really kind of meld down like all of those particular aesthetics and trends of the time into one particular piece of media, and then just really use that to like just sell it. And so I just sort of found that interesting in this one particular piece of media, that it really coalesced everything into just to one thing. And that kind of set off my ideas like, oh yeah, I totally remember that this was really a thing back in the early 2000s with just this kind of overall futuristic look, and I didn't really know too much about it. It was kind of a hazy, you know, childhood memory. But I thought it was, you know, kind of a good idea to really start diving in, and I had some kind of, you know, free time, so I was really interested in just kind of trying to find every possible example I could of this, and I kind of got really interested in it. I started making these kind of collages. You know, they're not like super amazing, but they really help with the process to kind of understand how, you know, I remember the time period, how I took the aesthetic kind of tropes and motifs from what I remembered from the era, just kind of mixing them and matching them to make these collages to really understand what that look kind of was composed of. Like, what is this a particular trend? Can this really be more like coalesce into something that makes sense as a particular category of design? And I definitely went overboard. I ended up going on an imager on Reddit, and I collected about 878 images of this aesthetic, just like going, you know, Google's, anything I could find. It was pretty much all online at that time. Didn't really have access to anything like physical books. But yeah, so I just went on this long kind of journey to collect all of these. Ended up posting them to Reddit as just this giant collection. It got some attention. People were kind of, you know, interested in seeing like where this could go and like what I was trying to do with it. Ended up posting it to the Vaporwave subreddits that I'd already followed, that primarily at that time were really focused on exploring that different era, really earlier in the 80s and the 90s. And so kind of moving it forward, you know, what is that sort of, you know, aesthetic of the millennium or that era? And so spent a lot of time on that. People kind of snowballed a little bit. People got really interested in it. It got me more excited about exploring that particular era. And I kind of then led to these different platforms. And so kind of expansions and different connections on different social media platforms. So really starting in 2014 on Reddit there with just various kind of subreddits, very early exploration into these kinds of design categories and aesthetics. And then really shifting because I wanted a place to share this with people that I could actually have more of a conversation and discussion. And Reddit is good for certain things, but it's not as great for very quick kind of conversational discussion and posting media, and people kind of play off each other, and you can develop kind of these ideas of aesthetics a lot faster, even though Facebook is sort of horrible in other ways. It was really great for this particular platform. So around 2014, 2015, started to create these groups on Facebook that were each dedicated to aesthetics. As I kind of discovered or understood each one in particular, they would kind of connect with each other, and then they would kind of grow, and people would post their own examples, and by people kind of participating, and then kind of participating in discussion, participating in something they remember that they post, and that really worked well into kind of speeding up the process of really understanding these. And then from that point, moving on from Facebook, and then once you have like kind of enough of an understanding of these particular groups, you can then move on to this kind of stage of curation and then really popularization on Tumblr at that time. So we started the Y2K Aesthetic Institute, tongue-in-cheek sort of term for that, but we started that around 2015 or 2016, really just focusing mainly on all the kind of Y2K aesthetic items. And that's really grown a lot, gotten some coverage and things like that with that particular one. So then from that point, after we kind of had these formed groups and these formed particular platforms, we kind of kept splitting off. You know, we've gone to Instagram, gone to Discord, if you've heard of that particular app or platform. It's really great for very quick ideation, discussion, posting of examples, things like that. It's also kind of more of a closed system, so some people that are really not like too comfortable with Facebook or those other kind of platforms, it was a bit easier for them to participate on that particular one. And then moving on, some new ones that have come out, that have been really helpful are Arena, which is just a really, really wonderful kind of design curation site that you can use to really kind of connect all of these aesthetics together. Oh, let me fix that. But then in 2019, we moved on to Twitter there, and that's really just kind of making sure that we're on enough different kind of differentiated platforms that they all kind of serve different purposes. And then in the future, we're hoping to kind of create our own centralized site that can really take this forward. Just going over kind of, we've got really five or six really core members shown here, and they all kind of have different roles. We've got the webmaster and kind of web design kind of guru on there. I've mainly focused on the curation. We've got kind of an assistant curator. Everyone kind of has their own specialty and a different design field that they come from, whether it's Max comes from a video game design background, Froyo comes from graphic design, I come from architecture and some interior design, and Cindy comes from kind of museum curation, and Zoe comes from definitely, as mentioned before, a web design background. So we'll just dive right into all these aesthetics here. In the background, you've got a crazy sort of diagram that I'll show later on that kind of just shows how I've been doing some of the ideation connections between these ones. So kind of starting with kind of the earliest era that we've been exploring, we've got what we've been calling kind of utopian ultramodern, which is that very 70s kind of continuous rainbow lines, inflatables, a lot of futurism that came after the 1960s sort of explosion there. Very optimistic kind of in its design, super graphics, icons. You've got one of the earliest kind of video game machines there. And yeah, so that's kind of one of the earliest ones that we've studied. It's particularly interested in, and it's a lot of influence on Gen X and Y2K. One of the other ones is, you've also maybe heard this term as a cassette futurism. It's called corporate airbrush, high-tech kind of style, and it's one that's also very much of an influence on, the synth wave and the retro wave kind of movements of the current era. The 80s kind of glowing laser grids and kind of airbrush design and wireframes and kind of things like that, and chromed out everything. So yeah, that one's kind of more of a recent one that I've been looking into. Here you got, we call either Pacific Wave or early cyber, and Pacific Wave references April Brayman, who's a really wonderful designer, definitely one of the kind of early progenitors of this kind of cyber design style, which has definitely led to a lot of different designs today. It's got really harsh tones, lots of like digital warping, and this was kind of one of the earliest eras when people are starting to really get involved with using computers in graphic design and using it in really all sorts of other fields. So you kind of see this huge explosion. Sometimes, it's like very hyper color. It also references kind of earlier types of imaging, graphics and things like that, military technology, MRIs and things like that. And they use those kind of sources and that inspiration to influence their own particular art here. lots of digitization, because at that time pixels, pixelization, things like that was kind of the limit of the technology at the era. And definitely one of my favorites here is Factory Poma, one of the ones I've been working on a lot recently. It's pretty interesting style. When I found it, was kind of going through things at the library and really diving deep into them, it definitely set off some childhood memories of like noticing these particular fonts or all these kind of hard graphics with the contrasting colors and things like that and alternating schemes. And so a lot of this design has to deal with what I've been kind of thinking about, why was this a thing? Like why was this such a kind of popular design motif of the era? We're trying to kind of postulate that maybe it had to do with the transition from, there was a lot of issues with deindustrialization around the 1970s and 1980s. And so what you've got here is you've got the move from kind of an industrial society to an information society, and there's less tangibility in kind of what people do on a daily basis and the industries of the country. And so you've got kind of maybe a desire to go back to these graphics that definitely harken to like, eras of industrialization, works progress, kind of movements. Definitely has a lot of influence of kind of early 20th century graphic movements and, hard-edged metals and things like that. Kind of mixed with then using them in a context of kind of here you can see like talking about multimedia, even though use like hammering discs and stuff like that. But so it's kind of that desire to give a sense of tangibility to something that information and kind of the internet and things like that at the time, which were very intangible. This one people totally love. It's, we call it like neon ooze surf. Sometimes called like rad dog because you've always got like a little rad dog with sunglasses and stuff on it. But yes, I think people may sort of really remember this one. I actually kind of had like a mini revival maybe a decade or so ago. It's got all the hypercolors, intense neons. It's got some like, kind of swirls and chunky swirls and just kind of maybe like a lot of Keith Haring influence and things like that with the kind of certain figures moving around and just very bright, very loud, very excited aesthetic. It makes sense. It was very associated with sports and surf and things like that, and active kind of industries and things like that. This one is one of the ones I recently was working on, calling it Fraser Bane, just named after the show. Just kind of because that show for me sort of represents that kind of sophisticated particular aesthetic of the late 1980s and the early 90s, where you've got a lot of like sepia tones and I think in a sense maybe a lot of nostalgia at the time period, but kind of for earlier eras and kind of going back after the 80s when it's all chrome and pastels and things like that and laser grids. You want to go to something that's more brown, earth tones, and kind of more sophisticated in kind of a very vague way. You've got serif fonts and things like that kind of abound in that era. That particular Friends episode with the kind of fake artifacts with that pottery barn and things like that. So this particular one definitely saw a lot in Seattle as well. But yeah, that one found kind of particularly interesting just for how popular it was at the time and how it kind of has vanished a little bit now. And then kind of playing off that particular aesthetic, we have Utopian Scholastic, which in a way I kind of see as the kids version of Fraser Bane, because it's got all of these kind of emphasis on really scholastic ideals and using kind of classical forms in architecture and all the kind of more stately fonts with lots of serifs and things like that, and also images that are just found from huge stock photo books just to represent basically the most kind of basic form of each particular item, and a lot of I Spy books and things like that definitely hold this aesthetic particularly intensely, but yeah. And then one of the earliest ones that I found after finding kind of Y2K, this was really the second one that I started to explore, I found really interesting, is a Global Village Coffee House, which deals a lot with it's kind of sometimes a little bit of a questionable sort of design movement of the 80s and 90s, a lot of kind of issues with sort of cultural appropriation definitely going on in maybe a more negative sense, really just being used to sort of sell items, but also in a way, some aspects of it really just are focused on kind of having a sense of a reaction against really, as I mentioned before, the 1980s kind of very clean, very luxurious sort of, those kind of movements is really kind of reacting against it with natural, organic, hand-drawn, kind of more flowing lines and things like that. Faux finishes and everything, so yeah. And then another one that is kind of more of a recent find, we call it Cyber Gen X Corporate. And it's interesting to kind of look at these because what you'll see is when I kind of go through these books, I'll notice that there's really sometimes a very clear pattern in the way that kind of corporations will use this, and they kind of develop these particular aesthetics, and one will become very popular, like Factory Pomo, and then all the corporations, everybody's using it, kind of saturates itself out, gets a little tired, and then this one kind of comes to gradually replace it, and it kind of represents different things. You know, for this particular one, it comes a little bit after, and technology was developing at a very rapid pace, but people at the same time were becoming much more familiarized with dealing with design on computers. There's less articles from this era that are like, oh no, you know, I don't know about the computer, let's go back to hands-on stuff, and like people are less freaked out about kind of diving in. And so what you get here is that combination of more of an interest in really diving into computer design, as well as advancing technology that allows for more kind of smooth graphics. You can see here like a lot of, it kind of references that Pacific Wave early cyber stuff from before, but things are getting smoother, they're getting the ability to kind of use more Photoshop effects basically on everything, overlay items, use different warping effects and different fonts, and it kind of flows through into the architecture of the era, mainly, you know, a lot of kind of tech and education focused items, entertainment spaces and things like that will sort of mimic those particular graphics with those kind of bluish, purplish, reddish tones, and then also even with some of the shapes where they're kind of more of these flowing shapes. Yes, and that one, and a lot of internet cafes for sure, some very harsh carpeting, very interesting carpeting, kind of fun shapes and things like that. But yeah, and this one's actually pretty funny. This is there's like a executive brainstorming room. So yeah, that kind of goes with that sort of idea at the time too of you know, the .com kind of revolution where it's like, oh, the workspace can be like super fun, and you know, it's I'll like, you know, have foosball and stuff or whatever in there and everything. So you get I got a lot of that. Kind of it extends beyond the aesthetic and kind of goes into the whole mood of the time as well. This one's pretty fun, plays a little bit off of Cyber Gen X Corporate, called Wonka Pomo, which is one that honestly I didn't even really think about exploring very much. It's kind of one of those ones where, my mistake, it's kind of, again, it's a very kids-oriented aesthetic from that era, and I hadn't really put much attention towards it, but once other people kind of online, especially on the Discord, and they were kind of telling me more about it, and they were getting really interested in figuring out, you know, what was that sort of Nickelodeon, Wonka, WB Kids kind of aesthetic of the 90s? And was that actually something that you could really coalesce down to particular tropes? Was there anything really there that you could kind of wind down? And so you get a lot of kind of, you know, particular fonts and slime and kind of explosive graphics and things like that, and kind of hazard symbols and everything. But sorry. Yeah, so that one's kind of one of the other recent ones that we've been working on. And finally getting to Y2K, which primarily around the early 90s to the early 2000s, just very sleek forms, a lot of references to kind of that early sci-fi era of the 60s and the 70s. We've got lots of surrealist kind of designs dealing with CGI and silver and metallics, kind of blobby forms and liquids. You know, we got the Mac computer there from, I think, 2001. This guy's like really cool outfit from, I think, a Japanese fashion book. A lot of Bjork stuff. Bjork was definitely really into that. Yeah. And then kind of here you have, and this one was one that a friend named Sloan found. It's definitely more of the kind of cool cousin of Y2K, more of the, like the hip sort of club-going Gen Xer or something like that. It's less of kind of the really exuberant futuristic forms and more kind of boiling them down to more minimalist designs. There's a lot of focus on clubbing, so there's a lot of focus on pill imagery, medical imagery of the time. There's even the Damien Hirst pharmacy restaurant from, I think, from the mid-90s. You've got a lot of emphasis on transportation. It's kind of, really found this one particularly interesting in how it kind of takes kind of the inspirations from what people were really living in that era. You know, you've got an emphasis on transportation and kind of the lifestyle of that particular person in the era and how it expresses itself through these particular spaces and aesthetics and designs. Lots of motion blur, kind of clinical, kind of playing off the medicine, got kind of clinical looking spaces and a lot of 70s influence on these particular designs. This one, Metal Heart, is a much more, definitely a niche aesthetic, mainly popular, maybe one of the first ones that was really mainly popular online in the very late 90s and early 2000s. It's kind of, in a way, it's a continuation of Y2K and really what the possibilities of computer-generated graphics were at the time, really taking them to the extreme in very aggressive forms, dealing with lots of kind of very, very dense graphics with kind of dark sort of, kind of dark themes and really kind of lots of overlays. You see a lot of, these are forum signatures from the early 2000s. People put a lot of, that's one thing I definitely kind of admire about this is that it's really one of those designs where people put a lot of time and effort and they're really very interested in kind of developing out their own kind of, unique identities online at a time when that was really formative on the internet. Yeah, and you see a lot of, here a lot of like Winamp and media player skins were super popular with that. They kind of like really dark and sort of edgy look to them with like aliens and lots of metal and stuff going on. But I definitely find that particularly really interesting and how much the internet has certainly changed in its aesthetic from that era where people were really going for a particular look rather than, it was definitely, maybe form over function at that point in terms of kind of decorating these out rather than having things be really just easily accessible and being super fast. At that time, you have a lot of websites with like dense graphics and you have to start playing music and you're like, and then you try to get through like a certain stage of it. It would take you into all these like strange kind of levels and things like that. So there's a lot of interest in web design and it was more about kind of the experience rather than kind of the function of the particular website. This one that plays off of the Gen X YAC aesthetic. It's kind of this, it's the, Zen spa and kind of bamboo shoots and, kind of that particular style of clothing, kind of early, fabric materials and, that sense of kind of very calm. And I definitely find this a lot. It's one of those aesthetics, some of these can kind of persist along much later in certain particular settings than you would kind of think they would. Well, this one really peaked in that particular era. You'll still sort of see it in some like fitness clubs and spas and things like that, places where in kind of the mind of the people doing the design work, it's still relatively applicable, which I also kind of find interesting how these kind of designs can really persist only in certain fields, but kind of in the collective consciousness, they will sort of slowly fade away. This one's a pretty fun one, calling it McBling, which it's basically the aesthetic of the 2000s where, you have the kind of explosion of wealth, and, a lot of questionable wealth and things like that, with kind of fraud, lots of fraudulent things, but at the same time, it's kind of very much reflected in the culture of the era where you have lots of fleur-de-lis and excessive maximalist designs, maximalism in graphics, lots of explosions of, various vector flowers and all sorts of like rainbows, and it's referencing lots of retro movements, it's more of a retro movement referencing design of the 70s and 80s, very excessive decoration on pretty much everything, just kind of that era where it's referencing, kind of earlier architectures, but really taking them to extreme, exaggerating the sizes, just using new materials to kind of create decorative motifs. You have kind of lots of older style decoration, but it's placed on newer materials like translucent materials, and that may be kind of a play off of Y2K where they're developing lots of materials, but here they're kind of taking those forms and then slapping a lot of graphics onto them everywhere. And that one really kind of did terminate around the same time. Kind of makes sense that it would terminate around the time of the the Great Recession and everything. So it's really kind of hit a wall just right at that time, because after that it wasn't really particularly viable as an aesthetic, just with the kind of consumer environment. Then we have Frutiger Arrow, which a friend has developed this one. She's been working a lot on it. It's more of a tech aesthetic of the time period. If you know Windows Vista, kind of that era of tech when it's a lot of bokeh graphics and grass, and like it's very natural, kind of supposed to be feeling very natural and organic, but very high tech at the same time, very soft, very accessible, kind of a humanism aspect to the design of these. This one is super prevalent, but it became, I think, highly unpopular basically at the beginning of this decade, just as people were really tired of skeuomorphic interfaces and all these kind of layering effects and everything, and that's when you end up getting into flat design with pretty much everything. And then kind of playing off of that, we've got Genericana, which is a very popular aesthetic in Seattle from what I can see. Kind of exploded onto the scene in really, I think, about 2007, right around the time that McBling maybe was kind of on the downward trend and people were looking for something a little bit more like, kind of, not exactly grungy, but something with like more of that kind of organic feel, this became quite popular and in a sense kind of replaced it as really the popular aesthetic to use in all sorts of spaces, bars, pretty much any space that's going to be needing to have like a hip aesthetic immediately as it opens and really just kind of fill in right into the neighborhood kind of scene. This is kind of the aesthetic that they chose at the time. You got a lot of flat graphics, references to earlier American kind of advertising vernacular from the really like early 20th century onward. You know, and the interesting thing about this one is that really it actually existed much earlier in kind of small bits and pieces here. You got one, this kind of beer case this is like from the early mid 90s. So there's exploration in this with particular design firms like Charles S. Anderson, Duffy Design in Minneapolis. They did a lot of work with this sort of style much earlier, like this creek bottle. We've got kind of references to kind of a vague sense of earlier American kind of advertising styles. You got of course, the hipster logo, which at this point is kind of falling away, but it's the one where there's always like a cross and there's like 4 letters on the thing, which is like it was overused to death and it's now pretty much gone, but yeah, for a time. And the Edison bulbs and yeah, those uncomfortable chairs. Then kind of playing off of that one that's also kind of another thing that's interesting is that you have particular aesthetics that may be more oriented to consumer spaces for bars and things like that. Then kind of piggybacking off of those, you'll have particular aesthetics that are maybe more corporate oriented and for the office space or for tech, and they will sort of still play off each other even though they are really dedicated to a different kind of a different industry. So here, kind of playing off of that, you have that kind of sort of sepia tone thing going on, and like her, and you've got flat graphics replacing the Fruitager Aero graphics. You've got everything's more back to matte finish. You got the kind of script fonts, this lobster font that was very popular for the time, and really going away from the earlier kind of shiny rendering styles of Y2K, and then making everything much more vector-based and flat finishes, flat design, exposed brickwork, stuff like that, really, and just kind of becoming its own particular style from that era. And then one of the last ones we termed bougie design, which is very popular in Seattle. I think that's when I moved here about 3 years ago, and right as I got here, it just exploded everywhere around this. It's the Monstera plant, Memphis design, kind of Matisse, and flowers and a lot of just pastels, and then sometimes exposed plywood, things like that. And then so you'll see that one a lot. It became quite popular. It's really, that one's been particularly interesting because as we've been doing our research, and since we've been doing it since about 2014, we've been able to see really the rise, the kind of initial couple of design examples, the kind of overall, proliferation and permeation into pretty much every design field. You've seen it kind of saturate itself. You've seen then the backlash kind of occurs. People get really starting to comment on how they get sick of it. They would like to see, something different. It'll kind of influence itself into maybe corporations or businesses that wouldn't typically be associated with like being on the cutting edge of design. So at that point, you're kind of starting to see that sort of backlash that will form against it. And so even though I have this kind of as being to the present, it's, I think, probably at this point relatively on the decline. This is one of the much newer kind of aesthetics that's really still bubbling underneath the surface, although I know it's pretty popular, I think, in the design circles online. We've been terming it a new grunge. It's maybe a reaction against kind of bougie in a sense, but it's kind of very intentionally ugly, and it's kind of intentionally breaking some of the rules of graphic design and pulling from aesthetics of earlier things like extreme sports or like death metal logos and things like that, and just kind of mixing up. You can see some kind of metal heart influence. So it's taking a lot of very disparate and kind of smaller, lesser known kind of references to design and kind of pushing them into this form that is intentionally kind of trying to be very dense and kind of just really, just kind of creating a really kind of visually interesting style. At least to me, it just seems very dense and very kind of, intentionally kind of trying to break those rules. So that's kind of the last of the particular aesthetics, kind of moving up all to the present day that we've been looking into. And so kind of wanted to point out some of the particular examples that I had found while we were doing our aesthetic research and just kind of motifs and things that I found particularly interesting in what was going on. So a lot of the times when we're kind of doing this research into here, I've been finding all sorts of, very questionable motifs that'll kind of keep reappearing, especially as mentioned before in the Global Village coffee house aesthetic. So you'll see a lot of things like kind of vague tribal figures that are like holding up coffee or holding up executives, or kind of holding up this quote. Yeah, like this quote is like, oh, for the days of when people like hanker, or for people that will like hold them on their feet, like hold them on a little chair or something. And it's just this kind of very, very strange feeling of seeing this stuff again, or really seeing it for the first time and realizing, kind of those really strange design movements that had disappeared, that just were kind of just for the era, maybe have some really issues that we should maybe address kind of over again. And kind of playing off of that, you just kind of have these particular design issues with GVC again just kind of has a lot of issues with kind of cultural appropriation, really used in a negative sense, and you find that a lot. This is from a commercial design magazine from the late 1980s, and it's just, just kind of seeing this as like a typical kind of design presentation, but they've got, it's called Sexy Savage, basically. So, but I mean, it's just, at the time, I guess it wasn't, it's kind of that sense where it just wasn't considered to be something that was, I guess, offensive or in that way. But now, just looking back on it, just finding all of these examples and using, like for this one, using Anasazi kind of Native American imagery as just to sell shampoo. And I looked into it, there's no connection with the actual Native Americans, it's just to sell it and stuff. So you find a lot of that, and just, these representations of people in groups, calling it like ethno, and then just sort of using it to sell items. And you find so much of this in the past that makes me makes me understand kind of the issue that people are still having with this, as it really kind of still exists in certain contexts. You find odd motifs again with what I call like globalization gaze, which they always have kind of these people on like 90s images are always kind of they got the globes in their eyes and things like that. So you've got these kind of strange issues with kind of how aesthetic tropes will kind of insert themselves into various designs, and that kind of represents overall kind of societal or social or economic trends in this really strange sort of subtle way that kind of now seems to really make more sense into kind of why the issues with the 90s and the globalization, kind of colonialism and things like that, and it kind of brings those up in an aesthetic sense and makes them really kind of front and center and kind of more obvious. And so we also kind of investigate a lot of kind of lighter stuff, which consumer design, ephemera, kind of failed. You find a lot of like failed products, failed concepts, lots of passing trends and designs of the era. We work with, so as you saw in there, Max Krieger, who goes by Don Gray, but they do a lot of work, or he does a lot of work with kind of dissecting like a lot of different consumer spaces. I don't know if you maybe you've seen this. There was a thread on the Cheesecake Factory dealing with just kind of the really insane sort of aesthetic and design motifs that really exist within there. You get like the Eye of Sauron kind of lights, and just the really excessive sort of design of that time, or of that particular restaurant. We also work with Kate Wagner, who runs McMansion Hell. Sometimes they do a lot of work with just dissecting really the kind of the oddities and just kind of just insanity of a lot of these McMansion spaces, really of the 2000s. And kind of in a lot of the work I do with like the Y2K era is just like filled with all sorts of failed products and concepts and things like that. You've got over here on the left is Motorola Maya, who was a virtual character that Motorola spent, I think, $1 million to have a commercial at the Oscars in 2000. She was going to be a virtual assistant that you call up. She was called the 24-hour talking internet, and she would provide you with like stocks or news or something, just like, hey Maya, like, tell me about like the weather or something, and she would like talk to you about this. But they had a huge commercial, a big flashy kind of presentation, and then it just vanished, and no one ever heard from it again. And just, I think that's one of the really fascinating things, is finding all of these kind of odd failed concepts and products. You've got DigiSense, which was supposed to allow you to smell the internet, which really sounds like a bad idea now. But yeah, so like they had kind of, I think, millions of dollars in funding. They had all the websites, they had all sorts of promotional events, and it was like just ready to get off the ground. I think they were trying to get it going, and then BAM just vanishes. And then at a certain point, everyone kind of forgets about it, and it becomes really hard to find any information on it. So it becomes more of a really kind of a journey to find these little design oddities. One I really love is, this is called the Scout Moto. And this was this kind of weird, kind of like alien little device that really functioned as a neighborhood guide, kind of before the iPhone, before Foursquare or Yelp or anything like that. This would provide you with all sorts of information on like, oh, what can you do today? What kind of events are going on? It really functioned as a proto smartphone in that form. And with that particular one, they launched in 3 cities. They only got to New York, and then when they were about to launch in Los Angeles, they actually went out of business, but they'd already paid for their opening party, so they had a party even though they'd gone out of business the day before. So it's just really kind of like just these odd things that you'll find. Levi's, Levi's in 2000 came out with a jacket that you could put an MP3 player and a smartphone, and everything was all integrated. Not the best like kind of form factor there, like with all the circuits and stuff. But so you're kind of supposed to be able to have this integrated sense of technology, and it did maybe push the kind of concepts forward. But how that works, a lot of these things try to push stuff forward, but they fail, and someone maybe takes some of the concepts, and now we have there are jackets that probably serve the same function, but it's just kind of that stepping stone. And this one, Skim.com, also really interesting. It was clothing that would have a particular code on it, this 6-digit code, and then what you do is you can wear it in a really obvious place on you, just be like walking around the neighborhood. And if someone was also aware of this, they could enter this code on the website. They'd like see you, they'd write it down and enter it on the website, and then they could find your profile online. So it's kind of this hybrid of the internet and real space. And again, they had like all the fashion spreads and all the big magazines. They spent millions. They produced all sorts of pieces of clothing, kind of this, at the time, very futuristic sort of style. And again, it kind of flamed out in a wild fashion. Everything just vanished. And so kind of finding those particular little oddities has been really fascinating, kind of rewarding in a certain sense. And then one that I didn't include on the aesthetic categories, but also found interesting as a design oddity is just particular trends that really, they come and they go, and they're huge at the time. So this particular one, we call it faux Pomo ruins. And you got, kind of placing the Vaporwave a little bit there, with like lasers and broken temples and lots of references to just like Renaissance and, ancient Roman, ancient Greek kind of designs. And, it's very popular at the time. It kind of infects into every particular kind of design language in space. You have some really great designs by site architects. I definitely looked them up if you haven't heard of them before. They were kind of a really, really progressive or exciting firm in the 80s. They did all sorts of really strange projects with Best, which is a particular store that doesn't exist anymore. But they had some really, really crazy kind of store designs in there. Unfortunately, those have all been kind of demolished as well. Kind of just how we work on these particular ones, just kind of going over how I kind of construct these design diagrams, which I've been working on a lot recently, to really form these all together, form connections between particular aesthetics, and it really helps to understand how they relate to each other, how they connect, how they evolved, how they don't relate. So, you have kind of like the red to indicate maybe a reaction against, or, a smaller line to indicate more of a subtle connection. And so just kind of using these particular techniques to really develop out our understanding of these movements and how they interact on a timeline scale. So this is kind of more of an expanded version of it. It's a little crazy looking at the moment, but it's kind of that idea of how we can really kind of understand all of these when there's been such an explosion of design over the past 40 years and such an explosion in like artistic production or production, even if it's, for a consumer audience and things like that. You have just this kind of insane degree of creation that's going on at the moment, and all these different small design subcultures, and kind of just discovering how they really interact with each other is something that I've been really very fascinated with, and I kind of really love to continue with this design, especially if it was on the CARI website, to actually have something that's interactive where you kind of click on any of these and then pop out with particular examples, and you can see what they relate to. So it's kind of a goal of what we're working on. And then just kind of a very basic overview of how we kind of understand how designs evolve into each other. I kind of discussed this one before, but just how as technology evolves and kind of sensibilities change and people's familiarity with different technologies evolves, you get changes in aesthetics, and that's how we we'll use these particular understandings of these motifs to really dissect them and then separate them out into different movements and then kind of relate them to each other. And then, understanding stylistic influences is super important with this particular field. And, you'll have ones that are very obvious. You get this particular logo on the left from Carl Schulpig. which I found in an Art Deco book on iconography. You've got, these kind of the strongman character holding up I-beams and stuff, so it's that very, Art Deco, WPA graphics, strong industrial sense. And then in Factory Pomo on the right, it's been kind of recontextualized in the way of, kind of very obviously recontextualized. I'm not even sure if that's exactly okay that they were able to use that, maybe they got permission, but yeah, they kind of then repurposed it into the idea of like, a typography factory, even though that's really not a tangible thing, it's just referencing that earlier imagery to give it more of a heft to what the kind of intangibility to what they were working on. And then you have kind of the more complex kind of influences that will form particular pieces of media, and especially revival ones that are going on at the moment. The centerpiece, this is Elliot, that's by Elliot Lee, who's very active kind of on these particular sites. And they've been doing like a really incredible job just, parsing out particular influences, so you get kind of this reference to, this is a Dior campaign from fall, winter of 2001, kind of the matrixy glasses, but at the same time you've got this kind of, maybe 80s chrome effect kind of text, but with these virtual flowers from Misha Klein painting and kind of the Y2K aesthetic, just like morphing those all together, and you kind of create this really complex sort of collage of aesthetics. And just kind of going over super quickly, just kind of as I kind of did before, but just using different social platforms in certain ways to kind of create a following, and then to really help have people have the right platform that's kind of comfortable for them to participate, and really to kind of have different ones for curation and interaction, and then eventually to kind of put these into one particular space while still kind of using them, but really kind of creating our own space in the future. And kind of what I've also found particularly fascinating, and it kind of relates to really the overall kind of theme of balance at the Seattle Design Festival, is this issue with what I've been calling the archival black hole. And when I kind of do a lot of my research, I noticed that in the era before the internet, you have a lot of primarily physical media, and everything's really stored. It's magazines, it's books, it's something that's tangible. It's something that, even though sometimes it's not accessible to everybody, it is in a format that's not really going to degrade or morph into an obsolete format and become inaccessible. So you have kind of that era, which is well understood at the time. And then as people start to move on to the internet, you get a real period of turbulence where you have this new exciting technology. People are really into dumping everything they've been working onto these websites, and they're just creating new kind of experiences on these websites. But the problem with that is that at the time they're kind of working with what they had, and so you get kind of small photos, and you get weird flash sites that will not work anymore, or you get kind of images that just have lost. There's no more archive of them, and then they'll kind of become lost in that era right there, kind of like around 2000. And then now it's kind of a bit more of a stable sort of situation with how we kind of have these items available online as the internet has sort of matured. But at the same time, there's still that particular issue with accessibility. Because a lot of the stuff that I've found is that even though they have kind of sites like the Wayback Machine or the Web Archive, which are supposed to function as a kind of a collective platform for people to really save all the design work that we've been doing over the past 30 or 40 years in a particular place, either they just really didn't have the resources or kind of the ability at the time to really save these sites. So I'll go back and kind of find them, and then a lot of them, they'll have strange formats that don't work. They've got they're locked, or again, they've got different kind of softwares that just don't exist anymore. You've got to kind of really try to go back and really piece these kind of designs and things back together all over again. And so, just for some of them, if you can't contact the creator or the company has kind of gone out of business, these designs are really just lost, which I think is just really kind of unfortunate. And I don't know if it really bodes well for kind of the future, where we have a lot of our content stored on, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 huge major like social media platforms. What's going to happen if one of them goes under, or if people really want to try something else or something, and then that disappears? They can take all the content with them, and then you've lost really a whole kind of era of design and the stuff that people have really put their heart into, and it creates a kind of a vacuum of design. Just kind of going over really a lot of the sources that we use. They're mainly online, but the Seattle Central Library has been amazing. They've got this huge archive of magazines and books and CDs, various online archives. As I kind of mentioned before, contacting the actual original designers. And definitely that one thing that's been interesting is that we've been able to use machine learning algorithms, the kind of the publicly available ones like reverse image search and things like that, to actually piece back together kind of these earlier sites, and they've been extremely helpful because you can just really just drop an image into there and then it'll kind of pop out with all of these new particular pieces, and then it'll kind of help reconstruct your understanding. But yeah, so it's kind of just one of the particular examples that I thought was kind of really interesting was this time that I found this one particular store in a magazine in interior design at the library, and then the problem is like you've got no actual information like on what this design is. You've just got, you've got the name and everything, which you'd think you'd be able to find that all over again. It'd be really easy. And then the problem is that when you search Hattie's Restaurant in Golden Valley, Minnesota, you get nothing online. So it's like, oh well, what am I supposed to do? So what I would do is kind of with this sense of research is that you search Golden Valley, and then kind of using kind of the knowledge of architecture of the era, you're like, well, that kind of looks pretty late 80s and stuff, and so why don't I just kind of search around, look at this particular building, then find the address of this building, drop that with the name of the restaurant into Google, and then you get kind of really unexpected find, and that 4 results down, you get the actual menu of the restaurant, which is just kind of crazy to me that it's actually even saved anywhere. And then by that extension, you'll get this huge archive of, I think, 700 menus that people have collected over the years, which is just like an oddly amazing sort of find. And it leads to just more and more discovery. So it's just kind of these strange paths that research can take online that I find very just exciting. This is how you can go from no information at all, having no hope of finding what you're looking for because it's just really lost, and there's no yellow pages from 1987 to go through and search for what this restaurant was. And then suddenly it's you just kind of stumble onto something and you find so much more, and it really keeps expanding the research, even though at certain times it feels like a dead end. This is kind of basically had some kind of media coverage over the past couple of years on various sites. Someone like ID and those kinds of sites that can be design oriented, and then on Arena itself, the platform that we use, they've been really great as kind of a partner. And then just kind of describing how this work that we've done has actually influenced kind of new designs and new artists' work. We have a lot of people that will kind of use our research as an archive, as a jumping off point, or a source of inspiration to kind of create their own works that take these and then kind of run with them in their own direction. So you'll have this one particular one, Crossnick, which is a video game that a friend is working on. I think this is a fashion line that a company did based on some of the research. They call it Party Like It's Y2K. And then various artworks, some music albums, and then you've got factory promo styled flyers. And so it's kind of really wonderful to see people take with what you've been kind of working on and what you continue to work on, and then take it in their own direction. This is one that I found really particularly fascinating. I definitely love it. I don't know if you've heard, so it's a video game or a PC game called Hypnospace Outlaw by another friend, Jay Tholen. And he did, we kind of discussed with him, but he's also used our research a lot to kind of form this game, which it is based on the idea of kind of the internet in 1999 and kind of using all of these, you get to use these aesthetics to kind of help kind of flesh out that world and create that particular design and really get people just diving right into kind of an imagined version of the internet in 1999. So you can kind of pick out, and that's the interesting thing, to pick out the factory promo fonts of the Global Village Coffee House kind of designs, or the Y2K blobby MP3 players that kind of reference that era, and just kind of understanding how these particular references can kind of influence the design. And somehow Vampire Weekend heard about Global Village Coffee House, because I heard, on some kind of podcasts that they were talking about it, so they've been, I think, influenced to do some kind of designs based on it. It's just odd seeing where it goes sometimes in terms of kind of what people will pick up on, and then they'll kind of run with it. We actually had recently an exhibit at the MAD Museum in New York City called YGK, and it focuses on new jewelry designers and kind of their creations and how they may have been influenced by the kind of Y2K era. And so Cindy down there, she worked with them to kind of create the particular design, and they kind of used that influence of Y2K to kind of create the museum's layout and design itself, which really kind of helped with the overall vibe of it. As well, you've got kind of people that will kind of take it in their own direction, influenced by kind of GDC, and create their own works or posters or kind of music albums and things like that, which I also find kind of really interesting. And then just overall, kind of at the end of it, what kind of values does this have? This research, and kind of going back to the original sort of idea of that recycling of retro movements and things like that. There's so much of that going on right now that I think it's very valuable to really understand exactly how these kind of retro kind of spaces are designed, or sorry, these retro spaces are really understood, and kind of what creates the overall feelings of them. And with so much emphasis on media right now of kind of exactly recreating, the feeling in Mad Men of the 1960s, or even much more recent times, like in Lady Bird, which I think is in 2001, and kind of really understanding what kind of really forms that aesthetic of that era, and how does that influence kind of what kind of the media looks like, what it feels like. And I think there's definitely a value in researching these eras of recent design that I feel like they haven't been really explored a lot in the past, and maybe kind of been overlooked. And then kind of what we can take with those, and elements that we can take from them that are kind of positive, like the optimism of Y2K, but really leaving behind certain elements of the design, because Y2K, while it was very optimistic, it emerged in an era where there wasn't really much of a consideration for climate change or sustainability or anything like that. So it was really just plastic everything, so like producing and without really feeling about the consequences of what that would actually mean, and imagining these futures that, well, they're very seductive, and they're kind of flowing spaces and things like that, and the kind of fantastical architecture of them, kind of actually creating those. It takes a bit more of an understanding of how we can actually live within sustainable means, and that just wasn't considered at the time. So there's elements to kind of pull from the past and these aesthetics that we study, and then some that we can really feel like we can kind of leave behind there. So really dissecting, I think there's a particular value to that. And that's it. Any questions?